Princeton University Press Audio presents The Origins and History of Consciousness by Erich Neumann, read by William Roberts. He whose vision cannot cover history's 3,000 years must in outer darkness hover, live within the day's frontiers. Goethe, Das Tödliche Divan. Forward. The author has requested me to preface his book with a few words of introduction, and to this I accede all the more readily because I found his work more than usually welcome. It begins just where I, too, if I were granted a second lease of life, would start to gather up the disjecta membra of my own writings, to sift out all those beginnings without continuations, and knead them into a whole. As I read through the manuscript of this book, it became clear to me how great are the disadvantages of pioneer work. One stumbles through unknown regions. One is led astray by analogies, forever losing the Ariadne thread. One is overwhelmed by new impressions and new possibilities, and the worst disadvantage of all is that the pioneer only knows afterwards what he should have known before. The second generation has the advantage of a clearer, if still incomplete, picture. Certain landmarks that at least lie on the frontiers of the essential have grown familiar, and one now knows what must be known if one is to explore the newly discovered territory. Thus, forewarned and forearmed, a representative of the second generation can spot the most distant connections. He can unravel problems and give a coherent account of the whole field of study, whose full extent the pioneer can only survey at the end of his life's work. This difficult and meritorious task the author has performed with outstanding success. He has woven his facts into a pattern and created a unified whole, which no pioneer could have done, nor could ever have attempted to do. As though in confirmation of this, the present work opens at the very place where I unwittingly made landfall on the new continent long ago, namely the realm of matriarchal symbolism. And, as a conceptual framework for his discoveries, the author uses a symbol whose significance first dawned on me in my recent writings on the psychology of alchemy, the Ouroboros. Upon this foundation, he has succeeded in constructing a unique history of the evolution of consciousness, and at the same time in representing the body of myths as the phenomenology of this same evolution. In this way, he arrives at conclusions and insights which are among the most important ever to be reached in this field. Naturally, to me as a psychologist, the most valuable aspect of the work is the fundamental contribution it makes to a psychology of the unconscious. The author has placed the concepts of analytical psychology, which for many people are so bewildering, on a firm evolutionary basis, and erected upon this a comprehensive structure in which the empirical forms of thought find their rightful place. No system can ever dispense with an overall hypothesis, which in its turn depends upon the temperament and subjective assumptions of the author, as well as upon objective data. This factor is of the greatest importance in psychology, for the personal equation colors the mode of seeing. Ultimate truth, if there be such a thing, demands the concert of many voices. I can only congratulate the author on his achievement. May this brief foreword convey to him my heartfelt thanks. C. G. Jung, March the 1st, 1949. Introduction. The following attempt to outline the archetypal stages in the development of consciousness is based on modern depth psychology. It is an application of the analytical psychology of C.G. Jung, even where we endeavor to amplify this psychology, and even though we may speculatively overstep its boundaries. Unlike other possible and necessary methods of inquiry, which consider the development of consciousness in relation to external environmental factors, our inquiry is more concerned with the internal, psychic, and archetypal factors which determine the course of that development. The structural elements of the collective unconscious are named by Jung archetypes, or primordial images. They are the pictorial forms of the instincts, or the unconscious reveals itself to the conscious mind in images which, as in dreams and fantasies, initiate the process of conscious reaction and assimilation. These fantasy images undoubtedly have their closest analogues in mythological types. We must therefore assume that they correspond to certain collective and not personal structural elements of the human psyche in general, and, like the morphological elements of the human body, are inherited. The archetypal structural elements of the psyche are psychic organs, upon whose functioning the well-being of the individual depends, and whose injury has disastrous consequences. Moreover, they are the unfailing causes of neurotic and even psychotic disorders, behaving exactly like neglected or maltreated physical organs or organic functional systems. It is the task of this book to show that a series of archetypes is a main constituent of mythology, that they stand in an organic relation to one another, and that their stadial succession determines the growth of consciousness. In the course of its ontogenetic development, the individual ego consciousness has to pass through the same archetypal stages which determine the evolution of consciousness in the life of humanity. The individual has, in his own life, to follow the road that humanity has trod before him, leaving traces of its journey in the archetypal sequence of the mythological images we are now about to examine. Normally, the archetypal stages are lived through without disturbance, and the development of consciousness proceeds in them just as naturally as physical development proceeds in the stages of bodily maturation. As organs of the psyche's structure, the archetypes articulate with one another autonomously, like the physical organs, and determine the maturation of the personality in a manner analogous to the biological hormone components of the physical constitution. Besides possessing an eternal significance, the archetype also has an equally legitimate historical aspect. Ego consciousness evolves by passing through a series of eternal images, and the ego, transformed in the passage, is constantly experiencing a new relation to the archetypes. Its relation to the eternality of the archetypal images is a process of succession in time. That is to say, it takes place in stages. The ability to perceive, to understand, and to interpret these images changes as ego consciousness changes in the course of man's phylogenetic and ontogenetic history. Consequently, the relativity of the eternal image to the evolving ego consciousness becomes more and more pronounced. The archetypes that determine the stages of conscious development form only a segment of archetypal reality as a whole. But by availing ourselves of the evolutionary or synoptic view, we can make out a kind of guiding line running through limitless symbolism of the collective unconscious, which helps us to orient ourselves in the theory and practice of depth psychology. An investigation of the archetypal stages also affords a better psychological orientation in a number of ancillary subjects. For example, the history of religion, anthropology, folk psychology, and the like. All these can then be brought together on a psycho-evolutionary basis, which would promote a deeper understanding. Surprisingly enough, these specialized sciences have not so far allowed themselves to be sufficiently enriched by depth psychology, and least of all by Jungian psychology. In spite of that, the psychological starting point of these disciplines emerges more and more plainly, and it is beginning to become obvious that the human psyche is the source of all cultural and religious phenomena. Hence, a final reckoning with depth psychology cannot be evaded much longer. We must emphasize that our exposition of myth is not based on any specialized branch of science, whether archaeology, comparative religion, or theology, but simply and solely on the practical work of the psychotherapist, whose concern is the psychic background of modern man. The connection between his psychology and the deeper layers of humanity still alive in him is therefore the real starting point and subject of this work. The deductive and systematic method of exposition here adopted may at first obscure the topical and therapeutic significance of our findings, but anyone familiar with psychic events at the deepest level will recognize the importance and relevance of these connections, whose detailed illustration by modern empirical material is reserved for later examination. As is well known, the comparative method of analytical psychology collates the symbolic and collective material found in individuals with the corresponding products from the history of religion, primitive psychology, and so on, and in this way arrives at an interpretation by establishing the context. This method we now supplement by the evolutionary approach, which considers the material from the standpoint of the stage reached by the developing consciousness, and hence by the ego in its relations with the unconscious. Our work, therefore, links up with that fundamental early work of Jung's, The Psychology of the Unconscious, even though we may be obliged to make certain emendations. Whereas in Freudian psychoanalysis, the evolutionary approach led only to a concretistic and narrowly personalistic theory of libido, analytical psychology has so far failed to pursue this line of inquiry any further. The emergence of the collective human background as a transpersonal reality has forced us to recognize the relativity of our own position. The multiplicity of forms and phenomena in which the infinite diversity of the human psyche is expressed, the wealth of cultures, values, patterns of behavior, and worldviews produced by the vitality of man's psychic structure, must make any attempt at a general orientation seem, at the outset, a perilous venture. Yet such an attempt has to be made, even with the knowledge that our specifically Western orientation is only one among many. The evolution of consciousness as a form of creative evolution is a peculiar achievement of Western man. Creative evolution of ego consciousness means that through a continuous process stretching over thousands of years, the conscious system has absorbed more and more unconscious contents and progressively extended its frontiers. Although from antiquity right down to recent times, we see a new and differently patterned canon of culture continually superseding the previous one, the West has nevertheless succeeded in achieving an historical and cultural continuity in which each canon gradually came to be integrated. The structure of modern consciousness rests on this integration, and at each period of its development, the ego has to absorb essential portions of the cultural past transmitted to it by the canon of values embodied in its own culture and system of education. The creative character of consciousness is a central feature of the cultural canon of the West. In Western culture, and partly also in the Far East, we can follow the continuous, though often fitful, development of consciousness over the last 10,000 years. Here alone has the canon of stadial development, collectively embodied in mythological projections, become a model for the development of the individual human being. Here alone have the creative beginnings of individuality been taken over by the collective and held up as the ideal of all individual development. Wherever this type of creative ego consciousness has developed, or is still developing, the archetypal stages of conscious evolution are in force. In stationary cultures, or in primitive societies, where the original features of human culture are still preserved, the earliest stages of man's psychology predominate to such a degree that individual and creative traits are not assimilated by the collective. Indeed, creative individuals possessed of a stronger consciousness are even branded by the collective as antisocial. The creativity of consciousness may be jeopardized by religious or political totalitarianism, for any authoritarian fixation of the canon leads to sterility of consciousness. Such fixations, however, can only be provisional. So far as Western man is concerned, the assimilative vitality of his ego consciousness is more or less assured. The progress of science and the increasingly obvious threat to humanity from unconscious forces impel his consciousness from within and without to continual self-analysis and expansion. The individual is the bearer of this creative activity of the mind, and therefore remains the decisive factor in all future Western developments. This holds true regardless of the fact that individuals cooperate and mutually determine the spiritual democracy in which they live. Any attempt to outline the archetypal stages from the standpoint of analytical psychology must begin by drawing a fundamental distinction between personal and transpersonal psychic factors. Personal factors are those which belong to one individual personality and are not shared by any other individual, regardless of whether they are conscious or unconscious. Transpersonal factors, on the other hand, are collective, supra- or extra-personal, and are to be regarded not as external conditions of society, but as internal structural elements. The transpersonal represents a factor that is largely independent of the personal, for the personal, both collectively and individually, is a late product of evolution. Every historical inquiry, and every evolutionary approach is in this sense historical, must therefore begin with the transpersonal. In the history of mankind, as in the development of the individual, there is an initial preponderance of transpersonal factors, and only in the course of development does the personal realm come into view and achieve independence. The individualized conscious man of our era is a late man, whose structure is built on early pre-individual human stages from which individual consciousness has only detached itself step by step. The evolution of consciousness by stages is as much a collective human phenomenon as a particular individual phenomenon. Ontogenetic development may therefore be regarded as a modified recapitulation of phylogenetic development. This interdependence of collective and individual has two psychic concomitants. On the one hand, the early history of the collective is determined by inner primordial images whose projections appear outside as powerful factors, gods, spirits, or demons, which become objects of worship. On the other hand, man's collective symbolisms also appear in the individual, and the psychic development or misdevelopment of each individual is governed by the same primordial images which determine man's collective history. Since we have undertaken to expound the whole canon of mythological stages, their sequence, their interconnections, and their symbolism, it is not only permissible, but imperative to draw the relevant material from different spheres of culture and different mythologies, irrespective of whether or not all stages are present in any one culture. We do not therefore maintain that all the stages of conscious development are to be found always, everywhere, and in every mythology. any more than the theory of evolution maintains that the evolutionary stages of every animal species are repeated in man's evolution. What we do maintain is that these developmental stages arrange themselves in an orderly sequence, and thus determine all psychic development. Equally, we maintain that these archetypal stages are unconscious determinants and can be found in mythology, and that only by viewing the collective stratification of human development together with the individual stratification of conscious development can we arrive at an understanding of psychic development in general and individual development in particular. Again, the relation between the transpersonal and the personal, which plays a decisive role in every human life, is prefigured in human history. But the collective aspect of this relationship does not mean that unique or recurrent historical events are inherited, for up to the present there has been no scientific proof of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. For this reason, analytical psychology considers the structure of the psyche to be determined by a priori transpersonal dominants, archetypes, which, being essential components and organs of the psyche from the beginning, mold the course of human history. The castration motif, for instance, is not the result of the inheritance of an endlessly repeated threat of castration by a primordial father, or rather by an infinity of primordial fathers. Science has discovered nothing that could possibly support such a theory, which, moreover, presupposes the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Any reduction of the castration threat, parricide, the primal scene of parental intercourse, and so on, to historical and personalistic data, which presumes to paint the early history of humanity in the likeness of a patriarchal bourgeois family of the 19th century, is scientifically impossible. It is one of the tasks of this book to show that, in regard to these and similar complexes, we are really dealing with symbols, ideal forms, psychic categories, and basic structural patterns whose infinitely varied modes of operation govern the history of mankind and the individual. The development of consciousness in archetypal stages is a transpersonal fact, a dynamic self-revelation of the psychic structure, which dominates the history of mankind and the individual. Even deviations from the path of evolution, their symbology and symptomatology must be understood in relation to the prior archetypal pattern. In the first part of our exposition, the mythological stages in the evolution of consciousness, the accent lies on the wide distribution of the mythological material, and on demonstrating the connections between the symbols and the various strata of conscious development. Only against this background can we understand the normal developments of the psyche, as well as the pathological phenomena in which collective problems constantly appear as the basic problems of human existence, and so must be understood in that light. Besides uncovering the evolutionary stages and their archetypal connections, our inquiry also has a therapeutic aim, which is both individual and collective. The integration of personal psychic phenomena with the corresponding transpersonal symbols is of paramount importance for the further development of consciousness and for the synthesis of the personality. The rediscovery of the human and cultural strata from which these symbols derive is, in the original sense of the word, bildend, informing. Consciousness thus acquires images, Bilder, and education, Bildung, widens its horizon, and charges itself with contents which constellate a new psychic potential. New problems appear, but also new solutions. As the purely personal data enter into association with the transpersonal, and the collective human aspect is rediscovered and begins to come alive, new insights, new possibilities of life add themselves to the narrowly personalistic and rigid personality of the sick-souled modern man. Our aim is not confined to pointing out the correct relation of the ego to the unconscious and of the personal to the transpersonal. We have also to realize that the false, personalistic interpretation of everything psychic is the expression of an unconscious law which has everywhere constrained modern man to misinterpret his true role and significance. Only when we have made it clear to what degree the reduction of the transpersonal to the personal springs from a tendency which once had a very deep meaning, but which the crisis of modern consciousness has rendered wholly meaningless and nonsensical, will our task be fulfilled. Only when we have recognized how the personal develops out of the transpersonal, detaches itself from it, but, despite the crucial role of ego consciousness, always remains rooted in it, can we restore to the transpersonal factors their original weight and meaning, lacking which a healthy collective and individual life is impossible. This brings us to a psychological phenomenon which will be fully discussed in Part 2, under the law of secondary personalization. This maintains that contents which are primarily transpersonal and originally appeared as such are, in the course of development, taken to be personal. The secondary personalization of primary transpersonal contents is, in a certain sense, an evolutionary necessity, but it constellates dangers which for modern man are altogether excessive. It is necessary for the structure of personality that contents originally taking the form of transpersonal deities should finally come to be experienced as contents of the human psyche. But this process ceases to be a danger to psychic health only when the psyche is itself regarded suprapersonally, as a numinous world of transpersonal happenings. If, on the other hand, transpersonal contents are reduced to the data of a purely personalistic psychology, the result is not only an appalling impoverishment of individual life that might remain merely a private concern, but also a congestion of the collective unconscious, which has disastrous consequences for humanity at large. Psychology, having penetrated to the collective layer in its investigation of the lower levels of the individual psyche, is faced with the task of evolving a collective and cultural therapy adequate to cope with the mass phenomena that are now devastating mankind. One of the most important objectives of any depth psychology in the future is its application to the collective. It has to correct and prevent the dislocation of collective life of the group by applying its specific points of view. The relation of the ego to the unconscious and of the personal to the transpersonal decides the fate not only of the individual, but of humanity. The theater of this encounter is the human mind. In the present work, a substantial part of mythology is seen as the unconscious self-delineation of the growth of consciousness in man. The dialectic between consciousness and the unconscious, its transformation, its self-liberation, and the birth of human personality from this dialectic form the theme of Part 1. Part 1. The mythological stages in the evolution of consciousness. Nature rejoices in nature. Nature subdues nature. Nature rules over nature. Ostanes. A. The creation myth. Nature rejoices in nature. Chapter 1. The Ouroboros. For what the center brings must obviously be that which remains to the end, and was there from eternity. Goethe, Westlicher Divan. The mythological stages in the evolution of consciousness begin with the stage when the ego is contained in the unconscious, and lead up to a situation in which the ego not only becomes aware of its own position and defends it heroically, but also becomes capable of broadening and relativizing its experiences through the changes effected by its own activity. The first cycle of myth is the creation myth. Here, the mythological projection of psychic material appears in cosmogonic form as the mythology of creation. The world and the unconscious predominate and form the object of myth. Ego and man are only nascent as yet, and their birth, suffering, and emancipation constitute the phases of the creation myth. At the stage of the separation of the world parents, the germ of ego consciousness finally asserts itself. While yet in the fold of the creation myth, it enters upon the second cycle, namely the hero myth, in which the ego, consciousness, and the human world become conscious of themselves and of their dignity. In the beginning is perfection, wholeness. This original perfection can only be circumscribed or described symbolically. Its nature defies any description other than a mythical one, because that which describes the ego and that which is described, the beginning, which is prior to any ego, prove to be incommensurable quantities as soon as the ego tries to grasp its object conceptually as a content of consciousness. For this reason, a symbol always stands at the beginning, the most striking feature of which is its multiplicity of meanings, its indeterminate and indeterminable character. The beginning can be laid hold of in two places. It can be conceived in the life of mankind as the earliest dawn of human history, and in the life of the individual as the earliest dawn of childhood. The self-representation of the dawn of human history can be seen from its symbolic description in ritual and myth. The earliest dawn of childhood, like that of mankind, is depicted in the images which rise up from the depths of the unconscious and reveal themselves to the already individualized ego. The dawn state of the beginning projects itself mythologically in cosmic form, appearing as the beginning of the world, as the mythology of creation. Mythological accounts of the beginning must invariably begin with the outside world, for world and psyche are still one. There is as yet no reflecting, self-conscious ego that could refer anything to itself, that is, reflect. Not only is the psyche open to the world, it is still identical with and undifferentiated from the world. It knows itself as world and in the world, and experiences its own becoming as a world becoming, its own images as the starry heavens, and its own contents as the world-creating gods. Ernst Cassirer has shown how in all peoples and in all religions, creation appears as the creation of light. Thus, the coming of consciousness manifesting itself as light in contrast to the darkness of the unconscious is the real object of creation mythology. Cassirer has likewise shown that in the different stages of mythological consciousness, the first thing to be discovered is subjective reality, the formation of the ego and individuality. The beginning of this development, mythologically regarded as the beginning of the world, is the coming of light, without which no world process could be seen at all. But the earliest dawn is still prior to this birth of light out of darkness, and a wealth of symbols surrounds it. The form of representation peculiar to the unconscious is not that of the conscious mind. It neither attempts nor is able to seize hold of and define its objects in a series of discursive explanations and reduce them to clarity by logical analysis. The way of the unconscious is different. Symbols gather round the thing to be explained, understood, interpreted. The act of becoming conscious consists in the concentric grouping of symbols around the object, all circumscribing and describing the unknown from many sides. Each symbol, lays bare another essential side of the object to be grasped, points to another facet of meaning. Only the canon of these symbols congregating about the center in question, the coherent symbol group, can lead to an understanding of what the symbols point to and of what they are trying to express. The symbolic story of the beginning, which speaks to us from the mythology of all ages, is the attempt made by man's childlike, pre-scientific consciousness to master problems and enigmas which are mostly beyond the grasp of even our developed modern consciousness. If our consciousness, with epistemological resignation, is constrained to regard the question of the beginning as unanswerable, and therefore unscientific, it may be right. But the psyche, which can neither be taught nor led astray by the self-criticism of the conscious mind, always poses this question afresh as one that is essential to it. The question of the beginning is also the question, whence? It is the original and fateful question to which cosmology and the creation myths have ever tried to give new and different answers. This original question about the origin of the world is at the same time the question about the origin of man, the origin of consciousness and of the ego. It is the fateful question, where did I come from, that faces every human being as soon as he arrives upon the threshold of self-consciousness. The mythological answers to these questions are symbolical, like all answers that come from the depths of the psyche, the unconscious. The metaphorical nature of the symbol says, this is this, that is that. The statement of identity and the logic of consciousness erected upon it have no value for the psyche and the unconscious. The psyche blends as does the dream. It spins and weaves together, combining each with each. The symbol is therefore an analogy, more an equivalence than an equation, and therein lies its wealth of meanings, but also its elusiveness. Only the symbol group, compact of partly contradictory analogies, can make something unknown and beyond the grasp of consciousness more intelligible and more capable of becoming conscious. One symbol of original perfection is the circle. Allied to it are the sphere, the egg, and the rotundum, the round of alchemy. It is Plato's round that was there in the beginning. Therefore the demiurge made the world in the shape of a sphere, giving it that figure which of all is the most perfect and most equal to itself. Circle, sphere, and round are all aspects of the self-contained, which is without beginning and end. In its pre-worldly perfection, it is prior to any process, eternal, for in its roundness there is no before and no after, no time, and there is no above and no below, no space. All this can only come with the coming of light, of consciousness, which is not yet present. Now all is under sway of the unmanifest Godhead, whose symbol is therefore the circle. The round is the egg, the philosophical world egg, the nucleus of the beginning, and the germ from which, as humanity teaches everywhere, the world arises. It is also the perfect state in which the opposites are united, the perfect beginning because the opposites have not yet flown apart, and the world has not yet begun, the perfect end because in it the opposites have come together again in a synthesis, and the world is once more at rest. The container of opposites is the Chinese Tai Chi, a round containing black and white, day and night, heaven and earth, male and female. Lao Tzu says of it, "There was something formless yet complete that existed before heaven and earth, without sound, without substance, dependent on nothing, unchanging, all-pervading, unfailing. One may think of it as the mother of all things under heaven." Each of these pairs of opposites forms the nucleus of a group of symbols, which cannot be described here in any great detail. A few examples must suffice. The round is the calabash containing the world parents. In Egypt, as in New Zealand, in Greece, as in Africa and India, the world parents, heaven and earth, lie one on top of the other in the round, spacelessly and timelessly united. For as yet nothing has come between them to create duality out of the original unity. The container of the masculine and feminine opposites is the great hermaphrodite, the primal creative element, the Hindu Purusha, who combines the poles in himself. In the beginning, this world was soul, Atman, alone in the form of a person. Looking around, he saw nothing else than himself. He said first, "I am." He was, indeed, as large as a woman and a man closely embraced. He caused that self to fall, pat, into two pieces. Therefrom arose a husband, Pati, and a wife, Patni. What is said here of the deity recalls Plato's original man. There, too, the hermaphroditic round stands at the beginning. This perfect state of being, in which the opposites are contained, is perfect because it is autarkic. Its self-sufficiency, self-contentment, and independence of any you and any other are signs of its self-contained eternality. We read in Plato, "And he established the universe a sphere revolving in a circle, one and solitary, yet by reason of its excellence able to bear itself company, and needing no other friendship or acquaintance." The perfection of that which rests in itself in no way contradicts the perfection of that which circles in itself. Although absolute rest is something static and eternal, unchanging and therefore without history, it is at the same time the place of origin and the germ cell of creativity. Living the cycle of its own life, it is the circular snake, the primal dragon of the beginning that bites its own tail, the self-begetting Ouroboros. This is the ancient Egyptian symbol of which it is said, "Draco interficet se ipsum, maritat se ipsum, impregnat se ipsum." It slays, weds, and impregnates itself. It is man and woman, begetting and conceiving, devouring and giving birth, active and passive, above and below, at once. As the heavenly serpent, the Ouroboros was known in ancient Babylon. In later times, in the same area, it was often depicted by the Mandaeans. Its origin is ascribed by Macrobius to the Phoenicians. It is the archetype of the Hento Pan, the All-One, appearing as Leviathan and as Ion, as Oceanus, and also as the primal being that says, "I am Alpha and Omega." As the Neph of antiquity, it is the primal snake, the most ancient deity of the prehistoric world. The Ouroboros can be traced in the revelation of St. John, and among the Gnostics, as well as among the Roman syncretists. There are pictures of it in the sand paintings of the Navajo Indians, and in Giotto. It is found in Egypt, Africa, Mexico, and India, among the gypsies as an amulet, and in the alchemical texts. The symbolic thinking portrayed in these images of the round endeavors to grasp contents which even our present-day consciousness can only understand as paradoxes, precisely because it cannot grasp them. If we give the name of all or nothing to the beginning, and speak in this connection of wholeness, unity, non-differentiation, and the absence of opposites, all these concepts, if we look at them more closely and try to conceive them, instead of just going on thinking them, are found to be images derived and abstracted from these basic symbols. Images and symbols have this advantage over the paradoxical philosophical formulations of infinite unity and unimaged wholeness, that their unity can be seen and grasped as a unity at one glance. More, all these symbols with which men have sought to grasp the beginning in mythological terms are as alive today as they ever were. They have their place not only in art and religion, but in the living processes of the individual psyche, in dreams and in fantasies. And so long as man shall exist, perfection will continue to appear as the circle, the sphere, and the round. And the primal deity who is sufficient unto himself, and the self who has gone beyond the opposites, will reappear in the image of the round, the mandala. This round, and this existence in the round, existence in the Ouroboros, is the symbolic self-representation of the dawn state, showing the infancy both of mankind and of the child. The validity and reality of the Ouroboros symbol rest on a collective basis. It corresponds to an evolutionary stage which can be recollected in the psychic structure of every human being. It functions as a transpersonal factor that was there as a psychic stage of being before the formation of an ego. Moreover, its reality is re-experienced in every early childhood, and the child's personal experience of this pre-ego stage retraces the old track trodden by humanity. An embryonic and still undeveloped germ of ego consciousness slumbers in the perfect round and awakens. It is immaterial whether we are dealing with a self-representation of this psychic stage, manifesting itself as a symbol, or whether a later ego describes this preliminary stage as its own past. Since the ego has and can have no experiences of its own in the embryonic state, not even psychic experiences, for its experiencing consciousness still slumbers in the germ, the later ego will describe this earlier state, of which it has indefinite but symbolically graspable knowledge, as a prenatal time. It is a time of existence in paradise, where the psyche has her pre-worldly abode, the time before the birth of the ego, the time of unconscious envelopment, of swimming in the ocean of the unborn. The time of the beginning, before the coming of the opposites, must be understood as the self-description of that great epoch when there was still no consciousness. It is the Wu Qi of Chinese philosophy, whose symbol is the empty circle. Everything is still in the now and forever of eternal being. Sun, moon, and stars, these symbols of time and therefore of mortality, have not yet been created. And day and night, yesterday and tomorrow, genesis and decay, the flux of life and birth and death, have not yet entered into the world. This prehistoric state of being is not time, but eternity, just as a time before the coming of man and before birth and begetting is eternity. And just as there is no time before the birth of man and ego, only eternity, so there is no space, only infinity. The question, whence, which is both the original question and the question about the origin, has but one answer, and of this there are two interpretations. The answer is the round, and the two interpretations, the womb and the parents. It is crucial for every psychology, and especially for every psychology of childhood, to understand this problem and its symbolism. The Ouroboros appears as the round container, that is to say, the maternal womb, but also as the union of masculine and feminine opposites, the world parents joined in perpetual cohabitation. Although it seems quite natural that the original question should be connected with the problem of the world parents, we must realize at once that we are dealing with symbols of origination and not with sexuality or a genital theory. The problem around which mythological statements revolve, and which was from the very beginning the crucial question for man, is really concerned with the origins of life, of the spirit and the soul. This is not to say that early man was something of a philosopher. Abstract questions of this kind were wholly alien to his consciousness. Mythology, however, is the product of the collective unconscious and anyone acquainted with primitive psychology must stand amazed at the unconscious wisdom which rises up from the depths of the human psyche in answer to these unconscious questions. The unconscious knowledge of the background of life and of man's dealing with it is laid down in ritual and myth. These are the answers of what he calls the human soul and the human mind to questions which were very much alive for him, even though no ego consciousness had consciously asked them. Many primitive peoples do not recognize the connection between sexual intercourse and birth. Whereas among primitives sexual intercourse often begins in childhood, but does not lead to the begetting of children, it is natural to conclude that the birth of the child has nothing to do with impregnation by a man in the sexual act. The question about the origin, however, must always be answered by womb, for it is the immemorial experience of mankind that every newborn creature comes from a womb. Hence, the round of mythology is also called the womb and uterus, though this place of origin should not be taken concretely. In fact, all mythology says over and over again that this womb is an image, the woman's womb being only a partial aspect of the primordial symbol of the place of origin from whence we come. This primordial symbol means many things at once. It is not just one content or part of the body, but a plurality, a world or cosmic region where many contents hide and have their essential abode. The mothers are not a mother. Anything deep, abyss, valley, ground, also the sea and the bottom of the sea, fountains, lakes and pools, the earth, the underworld, the cave, the house and the city, are all parts of this archetype. Anything big and embracing, which contains, surrounds, enwraps, shelters, preserves, and nourishes anything small, belongs to the primordial matriarchal realm. When Freud saw that everything hollow was feminine, he would have been right if only he had grasped it as a symbol. By interpreting it as the female genitalia, he profoundly misunderstood it, because female genitalia are only a tiny part of the archetype of the primordial mother. Compared with this maternal Ouroboros, human consciousness feels itself embryonic, for the ego feels fully contained in this primordial symbol. It is only a tiny, helpless newcomer. In the plurimatic phase of life, when the ego swims about in the round like a tadpole, there is nothing but the Ouroboros in existence. Humanity does not yet exist. There is only divinity. Only the world has being. Naturally, then, the first phases of man's evolving ego consciousness are under the dominance of the Ouroboros. They are the phases of an infantile ego consciousness which, although no longer entirely embryonic and already possessing an existence of its own, still lives in the round, not yet detached from it, and only just beginning to differentiate itself from it. This initial stage, when ego consciousness is still on the infantile level, is marked by the predominance of the maternal side of the Ouroboros. The world is experienced as all-embracing, and in it man experiences himself as a self, sporadically and momentarily only. Just as the infantile ego, living this phase over again, feebly developed, easily tired, emerges like an island out of the ocean of the unconscious for occasional moments only, and then sinks back again, so early man experiences the world. Small, feeble, and much given to sleep, that is to say, for the most part unconscious, he swims about in his instincts like an animal. And folded and upborne by great Mother Nature, rocked in her arms, he is delivered over to her for good or ill. Nothing is himself. Everything is world. The world shelters and nourishes him, while he scarcely wills and acts at all. Doing nothing, lying inert in the unconscious, merely being there in the inexhaustible twilight world, all needs effortlessly supplied by the great nourisher, Such is that early beatific state. All the positive maternal traits are in evidence at this stage, when the ego is still embryonic and has no activity of its own. The Ouroboros of the maternal world is life and psyche in one. It gives nourishment and pleasure, protects and warms, comforts and forgives. It is the refuge for all suffering, the goal of all desire. For always this mother is she who fulfills, the bestower and helper. This living image of the great and good mother has at all times of distress been the refuge of humanity and ever shall be. For the state of being contained in the whole, without responsibility or effort, with no doubts and no division of the world into two, is paradisal and can never again be realized in its pristine happy-go-luckiness in adult life. The positive side of the Great Mother seems to be embodied in this stage of the Ouroboros. Only at a very much higher level will the good mother appear again. Then, when she no longer has to do with an embryonic ego, but with an adult personality matured by rich experience of the world, she reveals herself anew as Sophia, the gracious mother, or pouring forth her riches in the creative fullness of true productivity, as the mother of all living. The dawn state of perfect containment and contentment was never an historical state. Rousseau was still projecting this psychic phase into the historical past as the natural state of the savage. It is rather the image of a psychic stage of humanity, just discernible as borderline image. However much the world forced early man to face reality, it was with the greatest reluctance that he consciously entered into this reality. Even today we can see from primitives that the law of gravity, the inertia of the psyche, the desire to remain unconscious, is a fundamental human trait. Yet even this is a false formulation, since it starts from consciousness as though that were the natural and self-evident thing. But fixation in unconsciousness, the downward drag of its specific gravity, cannot be called a desire to remain unconscious. On the contrary, that is the natural thing. There is, as a counteracting force, the desire to become conscious, a veritable instinct impelling man in this direction. One has no need to desire to remain unconscious. One is primarily unconscious and can at most conquer the original situation in which man drowses in the world, drowses in the unconscious, contained in the infinite like a fish in the environing sea. The ascent towards consciousness is the unnatural thing in nature. It is specific of the species man, who on that account has justly styled himself Homo sapiens. The struggle between the specifically human and the universally natural constitutes the history of man's conscious development. So long as the infantile ego consciousness is weak and feels the strain of its own existence as heavy and oppressive, while drowsiness and sleep are felt as delicious pleasure, it has not yet discovered its own reality and differentness. So long as this continues, the Ouroboros reigns on as the great whirling wheel of life, where everything not yet individual is submerged in the union of opposites, passing away and willing to pass away. Man is not yet thrown back upon himself against nature, nor the ego against the unconscious. Being oneself is still a wearisome and painful experience, still the exception that has to be overcome. It is in this sense that we speak of Ouroboric incest. It goes without saying that the term incest is to be understood symbolically, not concretistically and sexually. Wherever the incest motive appears, it is always a prefiguration of the hieros gamos, of the sacred marriage consummation which attains its true form only with the hero. Ouroboric incest is a form of entry into the mother, of union with her, and it stands in sharp contrast to other and later forms of incest. In Ouroboric incest, the emphasis upon pleasure and love is in no sense active, It is more a desire to be dissolved and absorbed. Passively, one lets oneself be taken, sinks into the pleroma, melts away in the ocean of pleasure, a Liebestod. The Great Mother takes the little child back into herself, and always over Uroboric incest there stand the insignia of death, signifying final dissolution and union with the mother. Cave, earth, tomb, sarcophagus, and coffin are symbols of this ritual recombination, which begins with burial in the posture of the embryo in the barrows of the Stone Age and ends with the cinerary urns of the moderns. Many forms of nostalgia and longing signify no more than a return to Uroboric incest and self-dissolution, from the unio mystica of the saint to the drunkard's craving for unconsciousness and the death romanticism of the Germanic races. The incest we term Uroboric is self-surrender and regression. It is the form of incest taken by the infantile ego, which is still close to the mother and has not yet come to itself. But the sick ego of the neurotic can also take this form, and so can a later exhausted ego that creeps back to the mother after having found fulfillment. Notwithstanding its own dissolution and the deadly aspect of the Ouroboros, the embryonic ego does not experience Uroboric incest as anything hostile, even though it be annihilated. The return to the great round is a happening full of passive, childlike confidence, for the infantile ego consciousness always feels its reawakening after having been immersed in death as a rebirth. It feels protected by the maternal depths even when the ego has disappeared and there is no consciousness of itself. Man's consciousness rightly feels itself to be the child of these primordial depths. For not only in the history of mankind is consciousness a late product of the womb of the unconscious, but in every individual life, consciousness re-experiences its emergence from the unconscious in the growth of childhood. And every night in sleep, dying with the sun, it sinks back into the depths of the unconscious to be reborn in the morning and to begin the day anew. The Ouroboros, the great round, is not only the womb, but the world parents. The world father is joined to the world mother in Uroboric union, and they are not to be divided. They are still under the rule of the primordial law. Above and below, father and mother, heaven and earth, God and world, reflect one another and cannot be put apart. How could the conjunction of opposites, as the initial state of existence, ever be represented mythologically except by the symbol of the conjoined world parents? Thus, the world parents, who are the answer to the question about the origin, are themselves the universe and the prime symbol of everlasting life. They are the perfection from whence everything springs, the eternal being that begets, conceives, and brings itself to birth, that kills and revivifies. Their unity is a state of existence transcendent and divine, independent of the opposites, the inchoate En Sof of the Kabbalah, which means unending plenitude and nothingness. The tremendous force of this primordial symbol of the psyche does not lie only in the fact that it contains in itself the non-differentiated state of union beyond the opposites. The Ouroboros also symbolizes the creative impulse of the new beginning. It is the wheel that rolls of itself, the initial rotatory movement in the upward spiral of evolution. This initial movement, the procreative thrust, naturally has an affinity with the paternal side of the Ouroboros and with the beginning of evolution in time, and is far harder to visualize than the maternal side. For instance, when we read in Egyptian theology such passages as Atum, who indulged himself in Heliopolis, took his phallus in his hand in order to arouse pleasure. A brother and sister were produced, Shu and Tefnut. Or, I copulated in my hand. I joined myself to my shadow, and spurted out of my own mouth. I spewed forth as Shu, and spat forth as Tefnut. This clearly expresses the difficulty of grasping the creative beginning in a symbol. What is meant would nowadays be called spontaneous generation, or the self-manifestation of a god. The original force of the images still shines through our rather more abstract terms. The Ouroboros mode of propagation, where begetter and conceiver are one, results in the image of immediate genesis from the semen without partner and without duality. To call such images obscene is to be guilty of a profound misunderstanding. Actually, life in those times was far more disciplined sexually, far purer than in most of the later cultures. The sexual symbolism that appears in primitive cult and ritual has a sacral and transpersonal import, as everywhere in mythology. It symbolizes the creative element, not personal genitality. It is only personalistic misunderstanding that makes these sacral contents obscene. Judaism and Christianity between them, and this includes Freud, have had a heavy and disastrous hand in this misunderstanding. The desecration of pagan values in the struggle for monotheism and for a conscious ethic was necessary and historically in advance, but it resulted in a complete distortion of the primordial world of those times. The effect of secondary personalization in the struggle against paganism was to reduce the transpersonal to the personal. Sanctity became sodomy. Worship became fornication, and so on. An age whose eyes are once more open to the transpersonal must reverse this process. Later creation symbols show how these matters came to be better formulated. Not that any repression had crept in. What was to be expressed had from the very outset no sexual connotations. It was meant symbolically. But the efforts with which early man wrestled for words give us some indication of what it was all about. The image of the self-fecundating primal god undergoes new variations in Egypt and India, and in both cases there is a move in the direction of spiritualization. But this spiritualization is the same as the endeavor to apprehend the nature of the creative force that was there in the beginning. It is the heart which makes all that results to come out, and it is the tongue which repeats, expresses the thought of the heart. That is what causes all the gods to be born. Atum with his Aeneid, and every divine utterance manifests itself in the thought of the heart and the speech of the tongue. Or, the demiurge who created all the gods and their castes is in his heart and in his tongue. And finally, we come to the most abstract and spiritual symbolism of all, where God is the breath of life. He did not bring me forth from his mouth, nor conceive me in his hand, but he breathed me forth from his nostrils. The transition from image to idea in this formulation of the creative principle becomes doubly clear when one knows that in the hieroglyphs thought is written with the image for heart and speech with that for tongue. At this point in Egyptian mythology and its wrestlings with the problem of creation, we have the first beginnings of what was to be expressed several thousand years later as the Word of God in the Bible's story of the creation and in the doctrine of the Logos, an expression that was never able to break away altogether from the primordial image of the self-manifesting and self-expressing God. Understandably enough, the creative principle that brings the world into being is derived from the creative nature of man himself. Just as a man, our figures of speech say the same thing today, brings forth his creations from his own depths and expresses himself, so do the gods. In like manner, Vishnu the boar scoops the earth out of the sea, and the god ponders the world in his heart and expresses it in the creative word. The word, speech, is a higher product, the utterance of one sunk in himself, in his own depths. When we talk of introversion, we say the same thing. In India, tapas, inward heat, and brooding is the creative force with whose help everything is made. The self-incubating effect of introversion, a fundamental experience of the self-generating spirit, is clearly expressed in the following text. He, Prajapati, took to praying and fasting, because he desired offspring, and he made himself fruitful. An Egyptian text says, My name was He who created himself, first God of first gods. The same principle of heating is described in another Brahmana as the way of creation. In the beginning, this world was nothing at all. Heaven was not, nor earth, nor space. Because it was not, it bethought itself, I will be. It emitted heat. After describing a long series of cosmogonic heatings and the production of elements, the text goes on, He found foothold on the earth. When he had found a firm foothold there, he thought, I will propagate myself. He emitted heat and became pregnant. Just as the maternal side of the Ouroboros gives birth without procreation, so the paternal side procreates without the maternal womb. The two sides are complementary and belong together. The original question asks about the origin of that which moves all life. To this question, the creation myths give one answer. They say that creation is something not altogether expressible in the symbols of sexuality, and they proceed to formulate the unformulable in an image. The creative word, creative breath, that is, creative spirit. But this breath concept is only an abstraction from the image of the procreative wind, Reusch, pneuma animus, which animates through inspiration. The solar phallus, symbolizing the creative element, is the source of the wind, both in an Egyptian magic papyrus and in the vision of a modern psychotic. This wind, in the form of the Reusch dove of the Holy Ghost, is wafted under the robe of the immaculately conceiving Virgin Mary, through a tube held out to her by God the Father in the Son. The wind is the fructifying bird known to the primitives, the ancestral spirit that blows upon the women, and also upon tortoises and female vultures, and makes them fruitful. Animals as fructifiers, gods as fructifiers, gods as animals, animals as gods. Everywhere the enigma of fructification is ranged alongside that of creative inspiration. Mankind asks about the origin of life, and immediately life and soul fuse into one, as living psyche, power, spirit, motion, breath, and the life-giving mana. This one who stands at the beginning is the creative force contained in the uroboric unity of the world parents, from whom it blows, begets, gives birth, moves, breathes, and speaks. As the wind blows, everything grows, says the Upanishad. Although the ego experiences, and must experience, the Ouroboros as a terrible dark power of the unconscious, mankind does not by any means associate this stage of its pre-conscious existence only with feelings of dread and drowsiness. Even if for the conscious ego light and consciousness cleave together, like darkness and unconsciousness, man still has inklings of another and, so he thinks, a deeper extra-worldly knowledge. In mythology, this illumination is usually projected into a knowledge acquired before birth or after death. In the Bardo Todl, the Tibetan Book of the dead man receives instruction, and the instruction culminates in the doctrine that he shall know himself identical with the great white light that shines beyond life and death. Thine own consciousness, shining, void, and inseparable from the great body of radiance, hath no birth nor death, and is the immutable light, Buddha Amitabha. This knowledge is post-conscious, outside and not of this world, a knowing and being in the perfection that comes after death. But it is also pre-conscious, pre-worldly, and prenatal. This is what the Jewish Midrash means when it describes knowledge to the unborn babe in the womb, saying that over its head there burns a light in which it sees all the ends of the world. Also, existence in the time before the beginning is supposedly connected with foreknowledge. The creature that still exists in the round participates in the knowledge of the unformed, is merged in the ocean of wisdom. The primal ocean, likewise an origination symbol, for as a ringed snake the Ouroboros is also the ocean, is the source not only of creation, but of wisdom, too. Hence the early culture heroes often come up from the sea in the shape of a half-fish, like the Babylonian Oannes, and bring their wisdom as a revelation to mankind. Since the original wisdom is pre-worldly, that is to say, prior to the ego and the coming of consciousness, the myths say it is prenatal. But existence after death and prenatal existence in the Ouroboros are the same thing. The ring of life and death is a closed circuit. It is the wheel of rebirth, and the dead man instructed in the Bardo Todl will infallibly be born again if he fails to attain to the highest knowledge in his afterlife. So for him, the instruction after death is equally a prenatal one. The mythological theory of foreknowledge also explains the view that all knowing is memory. Man's task in the world is to remember with his conscious mind what was knowledge before the advent of consciousness. In this sense, it is said of the tzaddik, the perfect righteous man of Hasidism, the mystical Jewish movement dating from the end of the 18th century, the tzaddik finds that which has been lost since birth and restores it to men. It is the same conception as Plato's philosophical doctrine of the prenatal vision of ideas and their remembrance. The original knowledge of one who is still enfolded in the perfect state is very evident in the psychology of the child. For this reason, many primitive peoples treat children with particular marks of respect. In the child, the great images and archetypes of the collective unconscious are living reality and very close to him. Indeed, many of his sayings and reactions, questions and answers, dreams and images express this knowledge which still derives from his prenatal existence. It is transpersonal experience, not personally acquired, a possession acquired from over there. Such knowledge is rightly regarded as ancestral knowledge, and the child as a reborn forebear. The theory of heredity, proving that the child has the ancestral heritage biologically in himself, and to a large extent actually is this heritage, also has a psychological justification. Jung, therefore, defines the transpersonal, or the archetypes and instincts of the collective unconscious, as the deposit of ancestral experience. Hence, the child, whose life as a pre-personal entity is largely determined by the collective unconscious, actually is the living carrier of this ancestral experience. In the dawn world of consciousness, where the feebly developed ego is still under the dominance of the unconscious, there rules, beside the symbolism whose mythological stages we are trying to describe, another set of symbols which correspond to the magic body image in the psyche. Certain groups of symbols are coordinated with certain regions of the body. Even today, the primitive body scheme of belly, breast, and head is used in ordinary psychology, where belly is an abbreviation for the instinctual world, breast and heart for the zone of feeling, and head and brain for the zone of spirit. Modern psychology and language have been influenced to this day by this original body scheme. The scheme is most developed in Indian psychology. In Kundalini Yoga, the ascending consciousness rouses and activates the different body-soul centers. The diaphragm is supposed to correspond to the Earth's surface, and development beyond this zone is coordinated with the rising sun, the state of consciousness that has begun to leave behind the unconscious and all ties with it. The body scheme, as the archetype of the original man in whose image the world was created, is the basic symbol in all systems where parts of the world are coordinated with regions of the body. This coordination is to be found everywhere, in Egypt as in Mexico, in Indian literature as in the Kabbalah. Not God alone, but the whole world is created in man's image. The relation of the world and the gods to the body scheme is the earliest concretistic form of the anthropocentric world picture, with man standing in the middle or at the heart of the world. It derives from one's own body sensations, which are charged with mana and are commonly misunderstood as narcissistic. The mana charge, originally associated with everything that belongs to the body, is expressed in primitive man's fear of magical influences, due to the fact that every part of the body, from hair to excrement, can stand for the body as a whole and bewitch it. Also, the symbolism of the creation myths, where everything that comes out of the body is creative, derives from the latter's mana potency. Not only the semen, but urine and spittle, sweat, dung and breath, words and flatus are heavy with creation. Out of it all comes the world, and the whole turnout is birth. For primitive man and the child, with his overemphasized unconscious, the main accent falls on the visceral region and its dead weight of vegetative life. The heart is for him the highest center, representing what the thinking head means for us. For the Greeks, the midriff was the seat of consciousness. For the Indians and Hebrews, the heart. In both cases, thinking is emotional, bound up with affects and passions. The dissolution of emotional components is not yet complete. See Part 2. Only if a thought is a passion that grips the heart can it reach ego consciousness and be perceived. Consciousness is only affected by the proximity of the idea to the archetype. But the heart is also the seat of ethical decision. It symbolizes the center of the personality, and in the Egyptian judgment of the dead, it was weighed. The heart plays the same role in Jewish mysticism, and even today we still speak of a man having a good heart, as though it were an ethical organ. Anything situated lower down than the heart belongs to the realm of instinct. The liver and the kidneys are visceral centers of great importance for psychic life. God trieth the heart and reins of the man whose conscious and unconscious are to be searched, and the examination of the liver as a divinatory center in haruspicy is as well known as the fate of Prometheus, who, for the theft of fire and the hybristic overextension of his consciousness, was punished with the aginbite of Inwit by Zeus, who sent an eagle to feed upon his liver. But all visceral centers, which also function as effective centers controlling sexuality, are already centers of a higher order. Deeper down lies the psychic plane of intestinal processes of the alimentary tract. The instinct to eat, hunger, is one of the most elementary of man's psychic instincts, and the psychology of the belly plays a correspondingly large part with primitives and children. One's state of mind is the more dependent upon whether one is satisfied or not, or thirsty or not, the less one's consciousness and one's ego are developed. For the embryonic ego, the nutritional side is the only important factor, and this fear is still very strongly accentuated for the infantile ego, which regards the maternal Ouroboros as the source of food and satisfaction. The Ouroboros is properly called the tail eater, and the symbol of the alimentary canal dominates this whole stage. The swamp stage of the Ouroboros and early matriarchate, as described by Bachofen, is a world in which every creature devours every other. Cannibalism is symptomatic of this state of affairs. On this level, which is pregenital because sex is not yet operative and the polar tension of the sexes still in abeyance, there is only a stronger that eats and a weaker that is eaten. In this animal world, since rutting is relatively rare, the visceral psychology of hunger occupies the foreground. Hunger and food are the prime movers of mankind. Everywhere we find in the initial creation myths a pregenital food symbolism, transpersonal because sprung from the original collective layer of symbols. The systole and diastole of human existence center on the functions of the digestive tract. Eating equals intake, birth equals output, food the only content, being nourished the fundamental form of vegetative animal existence. That is the motto. Life equals power equals food. The earliest formula for obtaining power over anything appears in the oldest of the pyramid texts. They say of the risen dead, "The sky clouds over, the stars rain down, the mountains stir themselves, the cattle of the earth god tremble at the sight of him as he appears before them with the living soul of a god who lives upon his fathers and devours his mothers. It is he who devours men and lives upon the gods, the catcher of skulls. He catches them for him. He of the resplendent head watches them for him and drives them to him. Their great ones are for his breakfast, their lesser ones for his dinner, and their little ones for his supper. Whomsoever he meets on his ways, he eats raw. He has taken away the hearts of the gods. He has eaten the red crown and swallowed the green crown. He eats the lungs of wise men. He is content to live upon hearts and their magic. He rejoices if he can devour those who are in the red crown. He flourishes, and their magic is in his body, and his glory is not taken from him. He has devoured the understanding of all the gods. We find a corresponding symbolism in India. In one account of the creation, the first divinities fall headlong into the sea, and hunger and thirst are delivered up to the negative powers of the primeval waters. The account continues, "Hunger and thirst said to him, the self, 'For us too also find an abode.' To them he said, 'I assign you two a part among these divinities. I make you two partakers among them. Therefore, to whatever divinity an oblation is made, hunger and thirst become partakers in it.' He bethought himself, 'Here now are worlds and world guardians. Let me create food for them.' He brooded upon the waters, and out of them that were brooded upon there arose a form. The form that arose is food." Food becomes a cosmic content to be seized hold of, and when the self finally managed to seize it with apana, the digestive breath, he consumed it. In another passage, hunger is symbolized as death. He is the eater and devourer, as we know from the deadly and devouring aspect of the Ouroboros. Even today, language cannot get away from these elementary images. Eating, devouring, hunger, death, and maw go together. And we still speak, just like the primitive, of death's maw, a devouring war, a consuming disease. Being swallowed and eaten is an archetype that occurs not only in all the medieval paintings of hell and the devil. We ourselves express the swallowing of something small by something big in the same imagery, when we say that a man is consumed by his work, by a movement or an idea, or eaten up with jealousy. On this level, where the Ouroboros is coordinated with cosmogony, the world or cosmic content to be assimilated is food. Food is a phase of Brahma. From food all creatures are produced, all creatures that dwell on earth. By food they live, and into food they finally pass. Food is the chief among things. Therefore they call it the panacea. Verily, he obtains all food who worships Brahma as food. For food is the chief among beings. Therefore they call it the panacea. All creatures are born of food. By food they continue to grow. Creatures feed on it, it upon creatures. Therefore it is called food. Brahma arises through tapas. From Brahma comes food. From food, breath, spirit, truth, worlds, and, in works, immortality. The same symbolism is used in the Maitrayana Upanishad, where the relation between the world and God is equivalent to that between food and the eater of food. God, once glorified as the world nourisher, is now seen as the world devourer, for the world is God's sacrificial food. Just as in primitive psychology and mythology, the alimentary Ouroboros is a cosmic quantity, so its symbolism also appears in the relatively late philosophical speculations of India for the purpose of clarifying the relations between God as subject and world as object, and vice versa. In this connection, we must mention the sacrifice that is offered to the god in the form of food and eaten by him. It is at once an act of incorporation, or inward digestion, and of seizure for increase of power. So the world in India is the food of the gods. As Dyson has explained, the world, according to an early Vedic idea, was created by Prajapati, who is at once life and death, or hunger. It was created in order to be eaten as the sacrifice which he himself offers to himself. This is how the horse sacrifice is interpreted, the horse standing for the universe like the bull in other cultures. Whatever he brought forth, he resolved to eat. Because he eats, everything. He is called infinite, Aditi. Therefore, he who knows the essence of Aditi becomes the eater of the world. Everything becomes food for him. From this it is clear that at a later age, correctly interpreting the old symbolism has spiritualized it or inwardly digested it. For the act of eating, digesting, and assimilating the world now appears as a means to possess and obtain power over it. To know the essence of a deity is to experience the infinite being of the Creator who eats the world he has created. Thus, on the primitive level, conscious realization is called eating. When we talk of the conscious mind assimilating an unconscious content, we are not saying much more than is implied in the symbol of eating and digesting. The examples from Indian and Egyptian mythology could be multiplied at will, for this sort of elementary food symbolism is archetypal. Wherever liquor, fruit, herbs, etc. appear as the vehicles of life and immortality, including the water and bread of life, the sacrament of the host, and every form of food cult down to the present day, we have this ancient mode of human expression before us. The materialization of psychic Princeton University is an archetype that occurs not only in all the medieval paintings of hell and the devil. We ourselves express the swallowing of something small by something big in the same imagery, when we say that a man is consumed by his work, by a movement or an idea, or eaten up with jealousy. On this level, where the Ouroboros is coordinated with cosmogony, the world or cosmic content to be assimilated is food. Food is a phase of Brahma. From food all creatures are produced, all creatures that dwell on earth. By food they live, and into food they finally pass. Food is the chief among things. Therefore they call it the panacea. Verily, he obtains all food who worships Brahma as food. For food is the chief among beings. Therefore they call it the panacea. All creatures are born of food. By food they continue to grow. Creatures feed on it, it upon creatures. Therefore it is called food. Brahma arises through tapas. From Brahma comes food. From food, breath, spirit, truth, worlds, and, in works, immortality. The same symbolism is used in the Maitrayana Upanishad, where the relation between the world and God is equivalent to that between food and the eater of food. God, once glorified as a world nourisher, is now seen as the world devourer, for the world is God's sacrificial food. Just as in primitive psychology and mythology, the alimentary Ouroboros is a cosmic quantity, so its symbolism also appears in the relatively late philosophical speculations of India for the purpose of clarifying the relations between God as subject and world as object, and vice versa. In this connection, we must mention the sacrifice that is offered to the god in the form of food and eaten by him. It is at once an act of incorporation, or inward digestion, and of seizure for increase of power. So the world in India is the food of the gods. As Dyson has explained, the world, according to an early Vedic idea, was created by Prajapati, who is at once life and death, or hunger. It was created in order to be eaten as the sacrifice which he himself offers to himself. This is how the horse sacrifice is interpreted, the horse standing for the universe like the bull in other cultures. Whatever he brought forth, he resolved to eat. Because he eats, everything. He is called infinite, aditi. Therefore, he who knows the essence of aditi becomes the eater of the world. Everything becomes food for him. From this, it is clear that at a later age, correctly interpreting the old symbolism has spiritualized it or inwardly digested it. For the act of eating, digesting, and assimilating the world now appears as a means to possess and obtain power over it. To know the essence of aditi is to experience the infinite being of the Creator who eats the world he has created. Thus, on the primitive level, conscious realization is called eating. When we talk of the conscious mind assimilating an unconscious content, we are not saying much more than is implied in the symbol of eating and digesting. The examples from Indian and Egyptian mythology could be multiplied at will, for this sort of elementary food symbolism is archetypal. Wherever liquor, fruit, herbs, etc. appear as the vehicles of life and immortality, including the water and bread of life, the sacrament of the host, and every form of food cult down to the present day, we have this ancient mode of human expression before us. The materialization of psychic contents, by which contents that we would call psychic, like life, immortality, and death, take on material form in myth and ritual and appear as water, bread, fruit, etc., is a characteristic of the primitive mind. Inside is projected outside, as we say. In reality, there is a psychization of the object. Everything outside us is experienced symbolically, as though saturated with a content which we coordinate with the psyche as something psychic or spiritual. This material object outside is then assimilated, that is to say, eaten. Conscious realization is acted out in the elementary scheme of nutritive assimilation, and the ritual act of concrete eating is the first form of assimilation known to man. Over this whole sphere of symbolism looms the maternal Ouroboros in its mother-child aspect, where need is hunger and satisfaction means satiety. The body in its autoerotic narcissistic sense of itself, we shall be reviewing this idea later on, is an Ouroboric closed circuit. In this pregenital stage, self-gratification is not masturbation, but the satisfaction of being nourished, with the infant's finger-sucking as a substitute. To obtain is to eat. It does not mean to be fertilized. To produce, to express, means to excrete, spit, urinate, later to speak, but not to give birth or beget. The masturbatory stage of Ouroboric creation is, on the other hand, genital in character, and precedes the sexual stage of the world parents, which is the stage of propagation and duality, and both are preceded by the stage of the alimentary Ouroboros. All the above bodily functions symbolize something that is at the same time a psychic process. The rites of cannibalism and the funeral feast, the eating of gods in the pyramid texts, and the communion mysteries represent a spiritual act. The assimilation and ingestion of the content, the eaten food, produces an inner change. Transformation of the body cells through food intake is the most elementary of animal changes experienced by man. How a weary, enfeebled, and famished man can turn into an alert, strong, and satisfied being, or a man perishing of thirst can be refreshed or even transformed by an intoxicating drink, this is and must remain a fundamental experience as long as man shall exist. The emergence of corresponding symbolisms does not mean regression to the oral zone in the sense that this is an infantile, perverse zone of sexual pleasure which we ought to overcome, but simply a return to Ouroboric symbolism, positively accented by the unconscious. Being fertilized by eating does not imply ignorance of the sexual act, nor is it in any sense an unenlightened substitute. It means total assimilation, rather than union with. It is something different from the above-mentioned fertilization by the wind. In eating, the accent falls on the bodily intake, but in the latter case, on the invisibility of the animating and fertilizing agent. Accordingly, at the stage of the maternal alimentary Ouroboros, the breasts are always emphasized, as for instance in the mythological pictures of the many-breasted Great Mother, or in the innumerable statues of the goddess who presses her breasts. Here the nourishing Great Mother is more generative than parturient. Breast and lactic flow are generative elements which can also appear in phallic form, because the milk is then understood symbolically as a fertilizing agent. The milk-giving mother, whose commonest symbol is the cow, is procreative, and on that account may even have a paternal character. Her child, as something she fertilizes, is then receptive and feminine, regardless of its sex. The maternal Ouroboros is still hermaphroditic and presexual, like the child. So the mother propagates by nourishing, just as the child is fertilized by eating and gives birth by evacuating. For both of them, the nutrient flow is a symbol of life without polar tension and entirely unsexual. The accentuation of the mother's breast and its phallic character, however, already forms the transition stage. The original situation is one of complete containment in the Ouroboros. When the phallic character of the breast emerges, or the mother is seen as the phallus bearer, it is a sign that the infantile subject is beginning to differentiate himself. Active and passive strivings gradually become distinct, the opposites making their appearance. Conceiving by eating and giving birth by excreting are differentiated as separate acts within the nutrient flow, and the ego begins to distinguish itself from the Ouroboros. This means the end of that beatific Ouroboric state of autarky, perfection, and absolute self-sufficiency. So long as the ego was swimming in the belly of the Ouroboros, a mere ego germ, it shared in that paradisal perfection. This autarky holds absolute sway in the womb, where unconscious existence is combined with absence of suffering. Everything is supplied of its own accord. There is no need of the slightest exertion, not even an instinctive reaction, let alone a regulating ego consciousness. One's own being and the surrounding world, in this case the mother's body, exist in a participation mystique, never more to be attained in any environmental relationship. This state of egolessness, interrupted by no pleasure-pain reactions, is naturally experienced by the later ego consciousness as one of the most perfect forms of autarky, bringing utter contentment. Plato describes the formation of the world in words that recall this containment within the Ouroboros. It had no need of eyes, for there was nothing outside it to be seen, nor of ears, for there was nothing outside it to be heard. There was no surrounding air to be breathed, nor was it in need of any organ by which to supply itself with food, or to get rid of it when digested. Nothing went out from or came into it anywhere, for there was nothing. Of design it was made thus, its own waste providing its own food, acting and being acted upon entirely within and by itself, because its designer considered that a being which was sufficient unto itself would be far more excellent than one which depended upon anything. Once more we meet the Ouroboric cycle of self-propagation on the alimentary level. Just as the Ouroboros fertilizes itself in the mouth by eating its own tail, so its own waste provides its own food, an ever-recurrent symbol of autonomy and self-sufficiency. This primordial image of the autarkic Ouroboros underlies the homunculus of alchemy, who is begotten in the round, the retort, by rotation of the elements, and it even underlies the perpetuum mobile of physics. We shall have to concern ourselves with the problem of autarky at all stages of our inquiry. because it is bound up with an important trend in man's development, namely, with the problem of his self-formation. So far, we have distinguished 3 stages of Ouroboros autarky. The first is the plurimatic stage of paradisal perfection in the unborn, the embryonic stage of the ego, which a later consciousness will contrast with the sufferings of the non-autarkic ego in the world. The second stage is that of the alimentary Ouroboros, a closed circuit whose own waste provides its own food. The third, genital masturbatory phase, is that of Atum, copulating in his own hand. All these images, like the self-incubation of one made pregnant through tapas, a later spiritual form of autarky, are images of the self-contained creative principle. Ouroboric autarky, even when it appears as a dominant archetype, must not be reduced to the level of autoeroticism and narcissism. Both these conceptions are only valid in cases of misdevelopment, when the evolutionary stage ruled by the Ouroboros persists for an unnaturally long time. But even then, the positive aspect must be borne in mind. Autarky is just as necessary a goal of life and development as is adaptation. Self-development, self-differentiation, and self-formation are trends of the libido no less legitimate than the extroverted relation to the object and the introverted relation to the subject. The negative evaluation implied by the terms autoeroticism, autism, and narcissism is only justified in pathological cases where there are deviations from this natural basic attitude. For the development of the ego, of consciousness, of personality, and lastly of individuality itself, is actually fostered by the autarky whose symbol is the Ouroboros. In many cases, therefore, the appearance of Ouroboric symbolism, especially if its formative and stabilizing character is strongly marked, as, for instance, in the mandala, indicates that the ego is moving toward the self, rather than in the direction of objective adaptation. Detachment from the Ouroboros, entry into the world, and the encounter with the universal principle of opposites are the essential tasks of human and individual development. The process of coming to terms with the objects of the outer and inner worlds, of adapting to the collective life of mankind both within and without, governs with varying degrees of intensity the life of every individual. For the extrovert, the accent lies on the objects outside, people, things, and circumstances. For the introvert, it lies on the objects inside, the complexes and archetypes. Even the introvert's development, which relates mainly to the psychic background, is in this sense bound to the object, despite the fact that the objects lie inside him and not outside, being psychic forces rather than social, economic, or physical ones. But besides this trend of development, there is another equally legitimate, which is self-related or centroverted, and which makes for the development of personality and for individual realization. This development may derive its contents from outside and inside equally, and is fed by introversion as much as by extroversion. Its center of gravity, however, lies not in objects and objective dealings, irrespective of whether the objects be external or internal, but in self-formation. That is to say, in the building up and filling out of a personality which, as the nucleus of all life's activities, uses the objects of the inner and outer worlds as building material for its own wholeness. This wholeness is an end in itself, autarkic. It is quite independent of any utility value it may have either for the collective outside or for the psychic powers inside. That we are nevertheless concerned here with a creative principle of decisive importance for civilization will be shown in its proper place. Self-formation, whose effects in the second half of life Jung has termed individuation, has its critical developmental pattern not only in the first half of life, but also back in childhood. The growth of consciousness and of the ego is largely governed by this pattern. The stability of the ego, that is to say, its ability to stand firm against the disintegrative tendencies of the unconscious and the world, is developed very early, as is also the trend toward extension of consciousness, which is likewise an important prerequisite for self-formation. Although in the first half of life, ego and consciousness are mainly preoccupied with adaptation, and the self-formative trend seems to be in abeyance, yet the beginnings of this self-realization process, while it only becomes noticeable with increasing maturity, lie far back in childhood. And it is here that the first struggles for self-formation are decided. The allegedly narcissistic, autistic, autoerotic, egocentric, and, as we saw, anthropocentric stage of the Ouroboros, so obvious in the child's autarkic and naive self-relatedness, is the precondition of all subsequent self-development. The same Ouroboric symbolism that stands at the beginning, before ego development starts, reappears at the end, when ego development is replaced by the development of the self, or individuation. When the universal principle of opposites no longer predominates, and devouring or being devoured by the world has ceased to be of prime importance, the Ouroboros symbol will reappear as the mandala in the psychology of the adult. The goal of life now is to make oneself independent of the world, to detach oneself from it and stand by oneself. The autarkic character of the Ouroboros appears as a positive symbol pointing in a new direction, whereas the Ouroboric incest of the neurotic and his pleromatic fixation denote an inability to break away from his origins and a refusal to be born into the world. The appearance of mandala and Ouroboros symbolism in the mature man is an indication that he must once more free himself from this world, for now he is fed up with it and come to himself. He has, by a new process, to bear himself out of this world, just as he had to bear himself into it with his nascent ego. Hence, the perfect figure of the Ouroboros, standing as it does at the center of the unconscious world of the primitive and the child, is simultaneously the central symbol of the second half of life and the nucleus of the developmental trend we have called self-formation or centroversion. The symbol of the circular mandala stands at the beginning as at the end. In the beginning, it takes the mythological form of paradise. In the end, of the heavenly Jerusalem. The perfect figure of the circle from whose center radiate the four arms of a cross, in which the opposites are at rest, is a very early and a very late symbol historically. It is found in the sanctuaries of the Stone Age. It is the paradise where the four streams have their source. And in Canaanite mythology, it is the central point where the great god El sits, at the source of the streams, in the midst of the sources of the two seas. The Ouroboros, traceable in all epochs and cultures, then appears as the latest symbol of individual psychic development, signifying the roundedness of the psyche, life's wholeness and perfection regained. It is the place of transfiguration and illumination, of finality, as well as the place of mythological origination. Thus, the great round of the Ouroboros arches over man's life, encompassing his earliest childhood and receiving him again in altered form at the end. But in his own individual life, too, the pleroma of universal unity can be sought and found in religious experience. In mysticism, where the self-re-entrant figure of the Ouroboros appears as the ocean of Godhead, there is often a dissolution of the ego, an ecstatic surrender, which is equivalent to Ouroboric incest. But when, instead of the death ecstasy of the ego, the Stirb und Werde principle of rebirth predominates, and the theme of rebirth prevails over that of death, this is not a regression, but a creative process. Its relation to the uroboric stage will be fully discussed elsewhere, for the distinction between creative and pathological processes is of the utmost importance in all depth psychology. For both processes, the Ouroboros is appropriate as a symbol of origination. In creative phenomena, too, and not only in religious phenomena, the life-spanning figure of the round signifies the regenerative sea and the source of higher life. It is, however, this same figure whose clinging embrace prevents the neurotic from being born into life. Then it is no longer the primordial figure of the Ouroboros, but, in the case of a more developed ego, the indication that a further stage has been reached, namely, the dominance of the Ouroboros over the ego, or the stage of the Great Mother. Chapter 2. The Great Mother. The Ego under the Dominance of the Ouroboros. When the ego begins to emerge from its identity with the Ouroboros and the embryonic connection with the womb ceases, the ego takes up a new attitude to the world. The individual's view of the world changes with every stage of his development, and the variation of archetypes and symbols, gods and myths, is the expression, but also the instrument of this change. Detachment from the Ouroboros means being born and descending into the lower world of reality, full of dangers and discomforts. The nascent ego becomes aware of pleasure-pain qualities, and from them it experiences its own pleasure and pain. Consequently, the world becomes ambivalent. The unconscious life of nature, which is also the life of the Ouroboros, combines the most meaningless destruction with the supreme meaningfulness of instinctive creation. For the meaningful unity of the organism is as natural as the cancer which devours it. The same applies to the unity of life within the Ouroboros, which, like the swamp, begets, gives birth, and slays again in an endless cycle. The world experienced by the waking ego of humanity is the world of J.J. Bachhofen's matriarchate, with its goddesses of motherhood and destiny. The wicked devouring mother and the good mother lavishing affection are two sides of the great Ouroboric mother goddess who reigns over this psychic stage. This growing ambivalence gives rise to an equally ambivalent attitude on the part of the ego towards the archetype in whose power it lies. The overwhelming might of the unconscious, that is to say, the devouring, destructive aspect under which it may also manifest itself, is seen figuratively as the evil mother, whether as the blood-stained goddess of death, plague, famine, flood, and the force of instinct, or as the sweetness that lures to destruction. But as the good mother, she is fullness and abundance, the dispenser of life and happiness, the nutrient earth, the cornucopia of the fruitful womb. She is mankind's instinctive experience of the world's depth and beauty, of the goodness and graciousness of Mother Nature, who daily fulfills the promise of redemption and resurrection, of new life and new birth. Over against all this, the ego consciousness, the individual, remains small and impotent. It feels itself a tiny, defenseless speck, enveloped and helplessly dependent, a little island floating on the vast expanse of the primal ocean. At this stage, consciousness has not yet wrested any firm foothold from the flood of unconscious being. For the primitive ego, everything is still wrapped in the watery abyss, in whose eddyings it washes to and fro without orientation, with no sense of separateness, defenseless against this maelstrom of mysterious being which swamps it again and again from within and without. Exposed to the dark forces of the world and the unconscious, early man's life-feeling is necessarily one of constant endangerment. Life in the psychic cosmos of the primitive is a life full of danger and uncertainty. and the demonism of the external world with its sickness and death, famines and floods, droughts and earthquakes, is heightened beyond measure when contaminated with what we call the inner world. The terrors of a world ruled by the irrationality of chance and mitigated by no knowledge of the laws of causality are made even more sinister by the spirits of the dead, by demons and gods, witches and magicians. Invisible workings emanate from all these beings, and the reality of these all-pervading effluences shows itself in fears, emotional outbursts, orgiastic frenzies, and psychic epidemics, seasonal bouts of lust, murderous impulses, visions, dreams, and hallucinations. One has only to know how great, even today, is Western man's primordial fear of the world, despite his relatively highly developed consciousness, to understand the world fear of the primitive and his feeling of endangerment. This same horror of nameless lurking forces is known also to the child, who is still incapable of conscious orientation and discrimination, confronting every event as though it were a devastating innovation and exposed to every whim of the world and man. In him, too, there dwells this primitive dread which comes from an outside world contaminated with the inside and made mysterious by projection, as we see it in the dynamistic and animistic world picture. This dread is an expression of the dawn situation when a small and feeble ego consciousness pits itself against the cosmos. The supremacy of the world of objects and the world of the unconscious is an experience that has to be accepted. For this reason, fear is a normal phenomenon in the psychology of the child. Although it is outgrown as consciousness increases in strength, it provides at the same time a transpersonal incentive to such development. Vital components in the growth of the ego and in the evolution of consciousness, culture, religion, art, and science spring from the urge to overcome this fear by giving it concrete expression. It is therefore quite wrong to reduce it to personal or environmental factors and to seek to get rid of it in that way. Owing to the disorientation of the infantile ego, the pleasure-pain components are experienced inseparately from one another, or at any rate, the object of experience is colored by a mixture of both. The non-separation of opposites and the resultant ambivalence of the ego towards all objects evoke a feeling of fear and impotence. The world is uroboric and supreme, whether this uroboric supremacy be experienced as the world or the unconscious, one's environment or one's own body. The dominance of the Ouroboros during the infantile phase of ego consciousness is what Bachofen describes as the time of the matriarchate, and all the symbols he associates with it still appear in this psychic stage. We must again emphasize that stage refers to a structural layer and not to any historical epoch. In individual development, and perhaps also in that of the collective, these layers do not lie on top of one another in an orderly arrangement, but, as in the geological stratification of the Earth, early layers may be pushed to the top and late layers to the bottom. We shall have to consider later on the contrast between masculine and feminine development. But one thing, paradoxical though it may seem, can be established at once as a basic law. Even in woman, consciousness has a masculine character. The correlation consciousness-light-day and unconsciousness-darkness-night holds true regardless of sex, and is not altered by the fact that the spirit instinct polarity is organized on a different basis in men and women. Consciousness, as such, is masculine even in women, just as the unconscious is feminine in men. Bachofen's matriarchate stands for the stage when ego consciousness is undeveloped and still embedded in nature and the world. Consequently, the Uroboric principle is also associated with the predominance of earth and vegetation symbolism. It is not the earth that imitates woman, but woman who imitates the earth. Marriage was regarded by the ancients as an agrarian matter. The whole terminology of matrimonial law is borrowed from agriculture, says Bachofen, recalling Plato's remark, "In fertility and generation, woman does not set an example to the earth, but the earth sets an example to woman." These sayings recognize the priority of the transpersonal and the derivative nature of the personal. Even marriage, the regulation of the sexual principle of opposites, derives from the earth principle of the matriarchate. At this stage, food symbolism and the organs, coordinated with it, are of prime importance. This explains why mother goddess cultures and their mythologies are closely connected with fertility and growth, and particularly with agriculture, hence with the sphere of food, which is the material and bodily sphere. The stage of the maternal Ouroboros is characterized by the child's relation to its mother, who yields nourishment. But at the same time, it is an historical period in which man's dependence on the earth and nature is at its greatest. Connected with both aspects is the dependence of the ego and consciousness on the unconscious. The dependence of the sequence child-man-ego-consciousness on the sequence mother-earth-nature-unconscious illustrates the relation of the personal to the transpersonal and the reliance of the one upon the other. This stage of development is ruled by the image of the mother goddess with the divine child. It emphasizes the necessitous and helpless nature of the child and the protective side of the mother. In the form of a goat, she suckles the Cretan boy Zeus and protects him from the devouring father. Isis brings the boy Horus back to life when he is stung by a scorpion, and Mary protects the Jesus child fleeing from Herod, just as Leto hides her divinely begotten children from the wrath of the hostile goddess. The child is the companion god of the Great Mother. As child and Kabir, it stands beside and beneath her, her dependent creature. Even for the youthful god, the Great Mother is fate. How much more, then, for the child, whose nature it is to be an appendage of her body. This relationship is most vividly expressed in the pre-human symbols, where the mother is the sea, a lake, or a river, and the child a fish swimming in the enveloping waters. Little Horus, the son of Isis, Hyacinthus, Erichthonius, and Dionysus, Melicertes, the son of Ino, and countless other beloved children are all under the dominion of the all-powerful Mother Goddess. For them she is still the beneficent birth-giver and protectress, the young mother, the Madonna. There is as yet no conflict, for the original containment of the child in the maternal Ouroboros is a state of uninterrupted reciprocal bliss. The adult ego connects the Madonna with this infantile stage, but the infantile ego, having as yet no central consciousness, still feels the amorphous plurimatic character of the maternal Ouroboros. Nevertheless, this child suffers the same fate as the adolescent lover who succeeds him. He is killed. His sacrifice, death, and resurrection are the ritual center of all child sacrifice cults. Born to die, dying to be reborn, the child is coordinated with the seasonal life of vegetation. The Cretan Zeus child, nurtured by the Great Mother in the shape of a goat, cow, bitch, sow, dove, or bee, is born every year, only to die every year. But the boy is also light, and therefore more than mere vegetation. One myth, very original in its primitivity, although only recorded in later times, tells us that the child was born every year, for it speaks of a light which every year shone forth from a grotto when the blood flowed at the birth of Zeus. The fate of the dying and sacrificed child, however, is not tragic like that of the adolescent lover. In the return to the deadly mother, the Mater Larum of the Romans, he finds shelter and comfort, for containment in the Great Mother enfolds the child, whether in life or in death. During the phase when consciousness begins to turn into self-consciousness, that is, to recognize and discriminate itself as a separate individual ego, the maternal Ouroboros overshadows it like a dark and tragic fate. Feelings of transitoriness and mortality, impotence and isolation now color the ego's picture of the Ouroboros in absolute contrast to the original situation of contentment. Whereas in the beginning the waking state was sheer exhaustion for the feeble ego consciousness, and sleep was bliss, so that it could later surrender itself rapturously to Ouroboric incest and return to the great round, now this return becomes more and more difficult, and is accomplished with increasing repugnance as the demands of its own independent existence grow more insistent. For the dawning light of consciousness, the maternal Ouroboros turns to darkness and night. The passage of time and the problem of death become a dominant life feeling. Bachhofen describes the mother-born, who know that they are born only of earth and mother, as being sad by nature. For decay and the necessity of death are one side of the Ouroboros, just because its other side signifies birth and life. The world wheel, the humming loom of time, the weird sisters, and the wheel of birth and death, all these symbols express the sadness that rules over the life of the adolescent ego. In this third phase, the ego germ has already attained a certain degree of autonomy. The embryonic and infantile stages are over. But although the adolescent no longer confronts the Ouroboros as a mere child, he has still not thrown off its suzerainty. The development of the ego goes hand in hand with a heightened plastic representation of the objects to which the ego is related. The maternal Ouroboros, unformed in the sense that the human figure has a form, is now succeeded by the figure of the Great Mother. The Ouroboric character of the Great Mother is apparent wherever she is worshipped in androgynous form, for instance, as the bearded goddess in Cyprus and Carthage. The woman with the beard, or with the phallus, betrays her Ouroboric character in the non-differentiation between male and female. Only later will this hybrid be replaced by sexually unequivocal figures, for its mixed and ambivalent character represents the earliest stage from which the opposites will subsequently be differentiated. Thus, the infantile consciousness, constantly aware of its ties with and dependence upon the matrix from which it sprang, gradually becomes an independent system. Consciousness becomes self-consciousness, and a reflecting ego having cognizance of itself emerges as the center of consciousness. Even before the centering of the ego, there is consciousness of a sort, just as we can observe conscious acts in the infant before the appearance of ego consciousness. But only when the ego experiences itself as something distinct and different from the unconscious is the embryonic stage overcome, and only then can a conscious system be formed that stands entirely on its own. This early stage of conscious-unconscious relations is reflected in the mythology of the mother goddess and her connection with the sun lover. The Attis, Adonis, Tammuz, and Osiris figures in the Near Eastern cultures are not merely born of a mother. On the contrary, this aspect is altogether eclipsed by the fact that they are their mother's lovers. They are loved, slain, buried, and bewailed by her, and are then reborn through her. The figure of the sun lover follows on the stage of the embryo and child. By differentiating itself from the unconscious and reaffirming his masculine otherness, he very nearly becomes the partner of the maternal unconscious. He is her lover, as well as her son. But he is not yet strong enough to cope with her. He succumbs to her in death and is devoured. The mother beloved turns into the terrible death goddess. She is still playing cat and mouse with him, and she overshadows even his rebirth. Where, as the god who dies to rise again, he is connected with the fertility of the earth and vegetation, the sovereignty of the Earth Mother is as obvious as his own independence is questionable. The masculine principle is not yet a paternal tendency, balancing the maternal female principle. It is still youthful and vernal, the merest beginning of an independent movement away from the place of origin and the infantile relation. These relations are